Michelle?
Daniel,
OG Rose.
and today we're going to be talking about an anchor reflection Michelle did on In Praise of Shadows by Tanizaki. This is also in honor of the Haokon Guild class that Daniel Zaruba is doing with Johannes. That's on Japanese thought and integrating practices to help make what is learned, not mere premises, but something that it is actually lived, something that's actually embodied, which is really important because it's so often just to absorb ideas and it not really have any impact or not become something we feel. And it's very rare that ideas that don't become experiences to us are actually things that change us. So it's a wonderful combination of philosophy, practice, that is very often a big push of work at the Haokon Guild, and so I'm very glad they're doing it. In Praise of Shadows is a wonderful text. It's a very unique text. It's a text that opens up new avenues of thought, and that makes I recall reading it and just looking at rooms differently. But you recently did talk on Anchor about it, Michelle.
Yeah, I just did a short reflection after. Honestly, I listened to the audiobook.
It's a good reading.
But it was a great reading. It was a great reading. And, of course, if you can read it, though, that's always great to see.
Nothing wrong with the oral tradition.
God bless audiobooks.
Yeah, God bless audiobooks. Hey, God willed for the Torah to originally be oral, Michelle.
That's
maybe
true.
maybe we've fallen. Maybe you're going back to how God intended things. So, maybe the rest of us are just heretics.
We're doomed. No,
We're
just
doomed.
kidding.
We're doomed.
Yeah, no, but it was a great essay. It's actually an essay,
right,
by Tanizaki, and he's a Japanese novelist, and I found it to be strikingly unique.
Oh yeah,
like I was really taken by his language. I was taken by his observations.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've never really thought about a bathroom the way that I did after.
Yeah, right at the start, right?
Yeah, like he just jumps right into it, like talking about bathrooms, you know?
Yeah.
And that was really fascinating to me. I thought that was interesting.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, he not to, I just love it. I can't help it.
Oh, it's great.
He shed a whole new light on things for me. Gotta get in those really bad puns.
Snaps. No, that was a good one.
Horrendous puns.
That's right. He puts things under a new light. Yeah.
And cast some shadows.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll have to come up with.
But there's no shadow of a doubt that it's a great
Daniel.
work. Yes.
That's it. Wow. Everyone's like, will they ever stop?
What are they talking about? There's toilets, shadows of doubts, and buns. Okay, all right.
Like, we'll maybe tune in next time.
Well, what a Friday.
Yeah. Well, but seriously, this was a very interesting text, and what I appreciated was actually just his appreciation.
Oh, yeah.
For the Japanese aesthetic,
yes.
What he just seemed to just candidly relish in about the way of seeing things in Japanese culture, the way that light is actually given space to move, given space to create, and for example, just the simple architecture of houses in Japan, how that actually becomes a canvas for the light to move through, and how that's actually the ornate. That's the element of decor that Japanese homes often will house, basically. And I thought that was very interesting. I think generally, like, what I think the biggest takeaway for me was in his observation of Western, basically relationships with light and Eastern relationships with light, is this idea of the bright light being the best in the West. This idea of like the stark, bright light being preferable, right? And the Japanese or the Eastern thinking embracing more of the dim lighting or the subtle lighting, nuanced lighting. He talks a lot about these old traditional ways of just lighting up a room at night, which is like candlelight, lamps, things like that. And so it got me in talking about some interesting things. I think when I started to give some words for describing what that might look like, bright lights can be sterile. They can be, a lot of times Western lighting is it's connected to electricity. It has a system of power grid. It's connected to a system, and it is usually stationary bulbs. It's interesting because now that I think about it, I'm glad we're talking about this because now more is coming to mind. The light bulb is also often a symbol of having an idea. And I think that a lot of rationality and reasoning, ideas are great. Ideas are fantastic.
Sure.
But I think there can also be an overextension of that, or a... Overfitting, yeah.
Right.
Or perhaps this thought that it's rationality and these ideas and these light bulb moments that are going to make, progress us as humanity, etc., etc. Right? And yet, if you think about it, a light bulb doesn't go anywhere.
Right.
So obviously that you can have, it's just the emphasis on rationality in the West that comes from these ideas of ideas, right? Whereas the Eastern practices and the Eastern orientation seems to be more focused on experiences.
Oh yeah.
And those overlap, obviously, ideas and experiences overlap, but there seems to be more of a focus on experience and the in-between, the shadows, the shading, the darkness, the light, that it's like this, it's not just like this aha idea moment that means progress. It's like, oh, no. It's actually this interplay between light, darkness, movement, shadows, shading.
Oh yeah.
And it's like there's so I just think that's quite interesting there. And I just want to say one more thing. So this idea of the light bulb, right? The ideas. So it's not as much about the this idea, the concept of West as rationality. The Eastern, it seems to be more about, again, the actual physical experience and I want to say almost quality. Quality of light itself, or even of ideas themselves, right? It's not so much about the abstracting the idea as an idea, but leaving the idea as an experience.
Marvelous. I think when working on the story Esperanza on the architecture of Havana, there was also kind of this idea that the building's architecture was designed so that it integrated with nature, that the lighting would come through the window at a certain time and had a certain area that would be closest to the kitchen so that you could enjoy it doing meals. So you had this entire sort of how do you design space, so on and so forth, to be fitting. But you had that good part, really great part where it's kind of like in the West we think about, and obviously when we talk about West and East, these are generalities, these are placeholders. But in the West we ask the question, is the light on and off or off? Where we see in Praise of Shadows this question of how is the light on? How does it dance with, like a flame? A flame dances with, but there's no real dancing in a light bulb. It's just on or it's off. There are those parts in Praise of Shadows where the food seems to taste better if it's dark.
Tanizaki seems to think so.
Yes. And there's actually these restaurants now that they don't have the lights on, which is kind of funny. And there are these experiences of beauty, of people, of that is brought out by there being something veiled, by something mysterious. And we see in psychoanalytical thought where desire needs veils, where the real in Lacan needs to be ventilated, not given to people all at once. And there's something about shadows what's really critical is a shadow is not darkness. A shadow only exists in light. There are no shadows at night per se. There's only shadows in the day, unless it's the moon. I suppose you have a really bright full moon.
I'm just smirking and smiling because I was listening to this audiobook and the kids were around. They're overhearing it. So then Haven's like, Mom, do you remember my philosophy of shadows? And so I paused the audiobook. I was like, what's that? Yes, I remember, Haven. Of course I remember. It's such a great philosophy. And he was saying he basically just said what you said. He's like, well, really important part of that philosophy is that if you don't have a shadow, you don't exist. So it was great.
That's really funny. What's that novel where the Book of M, where everyone loses their shadows, and then they gradually lose, like, people start not having shadows, but then gradually they lose their memory, and that shadow is connected to memories. It was a very neat premise. I think it's Book of M. So, yes, that's right. So you don't exist if you don't have a shadow, and that could have some Jungian archetypical implications. But it's something about shadows. What's very interesting is when you talk about a shadow, you're talking about something that emerges under very particular conditions, a particular type of lighting where objects are in certain places blocking the light to call shadows, or where the candle is lit, but it reaches only so far, and then the light doesn't go any further. So it's very conditional. It's very integrated into a particular setting, a particular architecture, and so on and so forth, where artificial light is not contingent at all. You just turn it on. Yeah, exactly. There's no contingency. There's no conditionality. It's on or it's off. And there is something about that brings to mind autonomous rationality that is so problematic in the West, or just kind of this very rigid rationality that is based on universals, non-conditionality, objectivity, non-subjectivity, non-personal. It's on or it's off. It's exactly. Rational or it's irrational. Whereas what you see here is a kind of architecture, a kind of culture that is suggesting that thinking must be very conditioned, that must be very aware of the settings, that is integrated into the particularity. And if it's not, there's a certain magic that's lost, per se. There's a certain experience that is lost. And then, he's always talked about things being hot. He's always talking about things being, like, blinding.
I guess Tanizaki doesn't like sweating.
Yeah, and it's like heat and different things, and it's overbearing. And something about rationality where people are, like, asking you to explain yourself that feels like you're under an interrogation light.
Yeah.
Just kind of asking you everything. And the other part, too, like what you mentioned with the bathroom at the beginning, where he's walking down this hall, and it's kind of inconvenient because it's on the other side of the house, but there's something extremely beautiful about for him walking on a full moon night.
I think it's even the fact that traditionally it was always outhouses, essentially. Japanese bathrooms were always outside. They were like apart from the house.
Yeah, so it was like a ceremony. It was like entering into a kind of temple. And so
exactly.
And you see, there is something about convenience that can take away those journey experiences. When you don't imagine if to get to Rustburg we had to ride a horse. That would be a very different experience than, say, just getting in the car and driving there. Now, if you had to ride a horse to go to Rustburg, which you might never forget, it would be a permanent memory, you probably wouldn't go to Rustburg very much, but it would create an experience. So there's always these trade-offs, and I think it's important to note in the book, he's not necessarily saying one way is better than the other. It's more inevitable. It's kind of like this is the way of things now, of the artificial light. But there is something deeply conditional, deeply aesthetic, and deeply experiential that is lost when you move in a more Western direction.
Yes, absolutely. And I thought that was really, really good. There was a particular quote that I thought was pertinent to this idea of the particularities and the conditionality, right? Like you said, a candle only casts light a certain distance, exactly.
Right. Certain range.
Yeah, exactly. And that's very fascinating, because something else that Tanizaki said was that basically beauty can, what was it? It was like beauty can only grow out of your reality. I thought that was really, 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 really interesting, because it shows how, we've had discussions quite a bit on this with Javier, with Thomas Jockin.
Sure.
This idea, like when we talk about like lack and beauty and concepts like that, but it's like there's something about having to be. You have to be. There's a conditioning. To be able to experience beauty, behold it, and also it kind of conditions you. Like you behold it, and you are beholden to it, and it transforms you.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so. Yeah, I thought that the quote from Tanizaki, this is it. Beauty must grow from the realities of life. I think I may have stated it that way, but that's just so good and so fitting, right? For light being particular.
Absolutely.
Because there's a universalization of a bright light.
Yes.
It casts the same light on everything.
Yes.
That's
right. And rooms don't really change through the day. No. Generally speaking.
No. And there's something about this kind of, even the multiplicity of the flame, like let's say we're talking about flame light. Well, it's moving. It moves. Or a gust of wind goes through the window or something, and there's turbulence in that flame. And there's motion there. There's just such an interesting, like it's a single flame, so there's something kind of, so there's a part of me it's like, well, does it cast, it could be kind of universal, maybe it's casting the same light, but it doesn't, because it has a particular location.
It's not as uniform either. The light is not as uniform. Maybe that's a good way
to put it. It's not as uniform.
Right.
And it can be, because it has this ability to move and have motion itself, it can sometimes, there's a shift in the lighting that already is there. It's always kind of it's not stagnant. It's always kind of available to movement.
Yeah, there's a few things. In the West, if you have a mythology that stresses light is God, darkness is bad, then it's interesting to think how metaphysics and architecture and all these things kind of go together, because then you're like, well, artificial light is good. It's good for there to always be light, because that is good. And that seems kind of like, oh, well, come on. But there is. I mean, in the paper Experiencing Thinking, we talk about high-order causality and high-order complexity, where one area that seems unrelated to another can actually get related precisely because of the human element, where you subconsciously associate light with good, and therefore artificial light is good. You don't think about, the only thing you miss is darkness, and darkness is bad. Therefore, you're better off. Whereas, even in Christianity, in some of the mystical traditions, or, My Bright Abyss, that poetry collection by Christian Wyman, I mean, there can be an idea that you need to talk about the darkness of God, this veiling of God to restore reverence to him and mystery, and how you can go too far in the direction of thinking of God as revealed, to the point where he's, there's nothing that the human finitude cannot comprehend.
Well, and also the idea of Lucifer, what is his name?
Oh, yeah, I mean, the star, light,
Right, there's this idea that, Lucifer himself Morning is actually the artificial light.
Yes, right.
We conflate just like, it's like, we see the nuance is not
light
there.
Bearer, yeah, the nuance.
Light bearer, right? It's like there's, if we can we have to get kind of particular. Like, we can learn and really learn this great lesson from the Eastern traditions and perspectives that, Tanizaki is talking about in Japan.
Yes.
Where we have to kind of get particular. Not all light is
capital
like,
L light.
Yeah, in a sense, if we're thinking theologically.
Yes, that's where the negative theology kind of came in. And there's a sense in which, if you were eating meals by a candle, in a sense, the lack of lowercase l light could point to the need for uppercase L light. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you have artificial light in the West and you're surrounded by lowercase L light, it's easier maybe to conflate lowercase L light with capital L light. Exactly. So actually by removing by removing light, that can help you orient yourself more toward capital L light. Maybe not. It depends on the particularities. But right. What becomes dangerous are these metaphysical kind of universals, kind of bulldozers, if you will, where you're not thinking about conditionality. You're like, no, light is always good under any situations, therefore light up everything. And that actually can then lead you into conflations of, say, finite light with infinite light. And that's where the corrective of the negative theology is actually quite important. I think it's interesting to think as well, where if you can only see according to candle. So with artificial light, you can basically see anything in a room anytime. And your thinking is not bound, really. You can walk into a room, you can see everything, you can think about everything. But if you had a candle, your thinking would be what you could look at and therefore think about without imagination, empirically, would be much more limited. Where in the West, if you can basically see everything in a room at all time, you can quote unquote be empirical about everything in the room. So lighting in the West can perhaps contribute to conflating empiricism and thinking together. Whereas if you're surrounded more by darkness and more by veils, and to actually remember everything in the room at a certain hour at night with just a candle, you'd have to imagine it. You'd have to use your imagination about a room you are in. You would get a very different kind of dynamic of thinking. You would have a different exercise of thinking.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting, because I was just thinking, like, yeah, wow, what are you not able to do because you can just switch on the light?
Yeah, exactly. You can basically do anything. I mean, with electricity. But thinking in a candlelight society, thinking would have to be much more observant, per se, which is funny. But, like, observe the setting, because the light's gone. So now you're bound in what you can think about and what you can do. But you have this kind of doctrine, I think it's a misinterpretation, but this, like, go out in nature and, dominate or subdue nature and different things. Well, likewise, when you have artificial light, it's kind of like, oh, we can think about anything at any time. We need to remove conditionality. We need to remove contingency and be able to think and do what we want whenever we want to, because that's what God wants us to do. Whereas in the East, the very lighting situation would make you more bound in what you could think about and look about, and that would transform how powerful you think thought is. Empirical thought, certainly, and then you'd have to turn to imagination, which maybe you would have better imaginations in the East, which I think, looking at some of the cinema and movie, as we talked with Daniel Zaruba, I think is indeed the case. And so it's interesting to think about, to be in a room where you only have candlelight, and therefore to even think about things in that very room, you would either, A, need to move the candle, but then the other things in the room that the candle's not near, you'd have to imagine. Or B, use your imagination. And so there's this much more dynamic interplay between, possibly in a candlelit setting, between imagination, thinking. They would go together much more.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, because it could definitely lend itself in the direction of overestimating the power of thought.
Yes, absolutely.
And also just overestimating your own power.
Oh, yeah.
Like what you're able to do.
Yeah.
I think there's something very humbling about basically older forms of lighting at night.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question. We could jump into the car right now, and because of headlights, we could go to IHOP or Waffle House. Because you would allow us to. I would allow us to, in reference to that talk, that philosophy lack 4, and I'll never, I did not mean...
You are welcome. After we do this talk, you want to go to a Waffle House or IHOP.
Anytime you want.
Till 3 in the morning, till 5 in the morning. You go for it.
Very good woman.
You go for it.
Very good woman. But you literally have the ability to jump in a car and go there. Yes. Are we better for that or worse for it? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the question. Mm-hmm. Are we better because we can do that whenever we want, or are we worse for it? And those are the kind of questions I think Japanese thought can present us with.
Definitely. I just wanted to circle back to something about the idea of conflating light and darkness in a theological sense with, like, all light is good or better, right? Or that, like, somehow even shadows and any darkness is bad, sort of the concept. Yeah. But again, it's like, because of the sun, if we think about the ultimate source of light, the sun, right? I love the sun.
It's pretty great.
I guess we can exist because of it.
Alive. I wouldn't like to go long without it.
I know. There's so many. It's such a rich symbol. Not on top of the fact that it's just gives this earth life, and all of us life and sustenance and abilities to see things and warmth, etc. But the point is that what's so interesting is inherently in the sun's movement, in its patterns, in its orientation, and our orientation toward the sun, it realizes this. You said something like, well, maybe we need to also recognize the darkness of God, or something like the veiledness of God. Yeah. Well, God's like, yeah, you guys can't have too much of me, so I gotta go. I gotta go. And then it's like, and then the morning comes, and and if we want to think of God as the sun as a symbol for God, or as a metaphor or analogy, it's kind of like, yeah, you guys cannot have too much of this, because it will actually destroy you ultimately.
Oh, sure.
So then the sun goes down, and then he comes up again. Sure. So it's like this I think it's so incredible to think about the patterns of even the universe, and think about how that has implications or meanings, or can reveal things about this idea that, see, there's something about both light and dark that's necessary.
Oh yeah.
Or I should say this: there's something about light and dark that exists, one, and also that is a part of existence and its continuation.
Oh yeah.
And there's a place for both. There's a place for both.
Well,
there's a place for the light and the veiling, I should say that.
Well, but this gets into kind of the interesting tendency of where you can end up in a lot of problems.
I mean, utter darkness would not be
outer darkness, sure.
Outer darkness or utter darkness.
Sure. But this gets into where it is interesting, where metaphysics, theology, philosophy is actually quite practical. Because if you say associate light with good, then you associate day with good, night with evil, and you will design your society in a manner to defeat darkness, thinking that night is evil, when night actually has a necessary mediating relationship with daylight. In the same way that God's veiledness has a very important role with his revelation or his revealedness. You can lose all that. Another example would be, there's a Japanese line of thought that kind of emphasizes brokenness as good, imperfection as good. It starts with a W. And it's kind of the idea that, and he kind of mentions this in Praise of Shadows, where he talks about the grime on the gold and how that's useful. But there's this story of this really beautiful cup, and this guy wanted to show it to some philosopher guy, and he wasn't very interested, and then he broke the cup, and they glued it back together, and then the philosopher was like, well, it's beautiful. And it's kind of the idea that once something is broken, then it's unique. It is interesting to think, if I were to break a bowl, that there are hundreds of thousands of copies of that bowl, and then literally glued it back together, that bowl would have a look that no other bowl on earth would have.
Right.
It would suddenly have a kind of uniqueness. Yeah. And similarly, in that line of thought is that perfection doesn't exist. That nothing is perfect. Perfection only exists in thought. Plato or something forms. And so when we try to be perfect, we try to be something that cannot exist, and that actually perfection is found in accepting imperfection per se, like that perfection in a kind of Thomistic fittingness. And so in a similar way, what can happen is if you say, okay, brokenness equals fall equals sin, therefore we should never have brokenness and should just have like furniture that never breaks or bowls that never break, well then you make a bunch of mass-produced characters, plastic stuff that has no character. And so, but you're avoiding brokenness, and brokenness is evil, so that's good, right? But it is if as you move away from perfection per se, or as people age and get older, you also can have an ancestor tradition in Eastern thought. Well, people individuate more and more as they get older. They get unique wrinkles, they have unique memories, they have unique stories they can put together. Like there's kind of an individuation that occurs with age, and we tend to associate age with bad and getting old and death, because in the West we associate death with like sin and bad things. Yeah. And so, there is something there as well where thinking about how, this bowl is beautiful precisely because it has been used, not because it's new. In the West we might associate the new with the beautiful, whereas what's brought up in Praise of Shadows is this kind of idea that no, it's beautiful because it's used, because it's aged.
Well, and it's funny that because it kind of fits into how he, near the end of the essay, where he gets into, we basically just like the elderly just get kind of pushed away, and it's everything is catered toward the young, and basically just that like there's really no place or even respect for the elderly.
Right.
And there's a way in which that translates to the lack of recognition for the place of dim lighting or like candle lighting. Absolutely. Or traditional lighting. I thought that was really neat how he got into just even how light reflects off of objects, off of like metal, and he got into like sand and clay and stuff like that. But like he was saying how the metal actually is more appreciated and enjoyable as it is in its, once it's lost its luster.
Right.
Once it has like a patina, or it's got the oils even of human touch and use, and that is really, that's the prime beauty, and it's cloudy.
Yeah.
He uses the word cloudy.
Well, because there's a story. I mean, it's kind of like age brings story. Newness doesn't have a story, and so there is a beauty in something that's worn. Something that's put up the good fight, per se. Something that's been used. Something that has a story. And
it's like they'll value story over perfection.
Yeah, and there's something about this, the meaning crisis that is people don't have story. People don't feel like they're part of a story.
And I also feel like I can't be loved, accepted, appreciate it unless I'm perfect.
Yeah, and that gets into the philosophy I'm trying to search for W, where it's kind of there, they warn you, it's like, hey, if you try to be perfect, you're doomed because you can't be perfect, and then everyone's going to be like crazy trying to be perfect. What you really want to do is to be able to see the beauty of imperfection, because that's what everything is. And so if there's basically no chance of seeing beauty unless you see it in the imperfection, because imperfection is all that exists. And that imperfection is the conditionality of reality in which beauty can be found. So I do think the language which we try to use of conditionality is very important. I sometimes think about talking about, there's a lot of talk of being, becoming. You almost need to talk about conditioning, conditions, because everything is always conditioned, and they're conditioning things that they interact with and being conditioned by them. It's kind of a feedback loop that's kind of part of that. And really, if we take seriously the idea that certain architecture at certain times creates certain shadows, which creates a beauty that is special, and that it's worth creating your society around that possibility, as opposed to just trying to be ultra efficient.
Right.
That does seem to be a architectural setting of which might suggest what is missing in people's lives that is contributing to the meaning crisis, because it's not taking everyone feels like just another person. They just feel like another cookie cutter, and so there's not a valuing of conditionality.
So I don't know if you remember this, Daniel, but years ago I had this little graph thing that, I don't know, to me I was like, this is profound. It was literally a line. These are my like profound graphs and diagrams. It's like literally it's a line, Michelle. But anyways, it's basically though there is meaning to this. It's like you have a starting point, okay, and there's a line that you draw out from it. Just that's it. There's your diagram. Now, but the point is that there's the line is going to be segmented into a first and a second, and what's interesting is that if we're taking into consideration the meaning crisis, et cetera, you get this putting first perfection, right? And yet that leads to so much brokenness. You fall short of that perfection. You feel like you'll never be perfect and not feel. And so my thought was always with this little diagram that can apply to many different things. It's kind of the C.S. Lewis concept, right? First things first, second things. So it's like, I always thought to myself like, So, and see, this is the other aspect of my little diagram that you actually, I guess, can never actually draw, because this line goes on for eternity, okay?
I haven't drawn eternity yet.
Daniel, if you just try hard enough,
if I wouldn't stop.
Oh, my word. But I was like, I guess there were times in my life when you're making decisions where you're like, this is like what I kind of really want in my ego or in my and that's what or some of the desires that you kind of get from the zeitgeist or whatever, and it's like, well, I could get that, but then the thing is there's going to be a point where it switches to basically literally the opposite, and then that's what's going to be forever. So which do you want? Which do you want? And so it for me, it was always pretty powerful. I know this might sound very hard to understand, this little diagram.
No, it's very important.
But yeah, so it's kind of like here's a diagram. You got your line. There's like a segment. Let's just say 1, 2, 3, 4. Then you stop, and then it suddenly switches to literally the opposite, and that goes on forever.
Right.
Okay, so it's like, do you want to put perfection first, or do you want to put brokenness first?
Yeah, excellent. Absolutely.
So if you put perfection first, unfortunately, what that leads to is an eternity of brokenness, because you'll always feel like you fall short. You'll be like, well, I'm not going to be loved if I'm not perfect. It's just miserable. Well, it can be, but not that you go around shattering stuff, but if you embrace the fact that life is inherently, there's a brokenness to life. There's a brokenness. There's an inherent brokenness that's just in the world, right? That it will be encountered in the world. That's actually a part of every human being. Right. Okay? That if you embrace that and accept that, that's your first part of the line.
Right.
And then, boop, it makes that switch. And then suddenly, for eternity, guess what you get to enjoy?
Right.
Perfection.
Right.
And that's not because we can ever achieve perfection as humans, but there's something perfect about embracing the imperfect.
Yeah, and that's
what I mean by that. So I hope...
No, that's the Japanese... That's what, there is... Once that bowl has been used, and you accept the brokenness and see beauty in the brokenness. It is perfect in that brokenness, and it can be that perfect forever because you've started it as broken. But if it starts with perfect and you're trying to keep it perfect, by definition, it must eventually not be perfect. Mm-hmm. It must age at the very least. Well, the moment it ages 1%, it is no longer 100%. It is now 99%, and therefore you've lost everything. It is no longer perfect.
What's interesting, because I was just thinking about this, I was thinking about how kids love, like, a certain bowl. They're like, yes, that's their favorite bowl or whatever.
Yes.
I wonder, it's interesting because really the problems of perfection in how we're talking about it actually comes from comparing your bowl to other bowls.
That's exactly right.
Whereas if you have the particularity, like this single flame that can only be made by you, not the system, like I talked about in
located
the anchor,
in a relation,
right? Your relation relationally, then it's like actually, it's by a larger measure, it's not perfect, but it's perfect for you.
And that's the genius, as I understand it, of the Thomas move on perfect, where it's perfect because it is fitting. For the individual, it is fitting. It is it is for them. It is what is good for them. But again, but here's the funny thing. In order for a thing to be fitting for an individual, almost by definition, it has to be quote unquote broken relative to the perfect, because it has to be individuated. So in order to have relationships, per se, unique relationships, you almost have to move away from the uniform and the quote-unquote perfect. Which then, again, of course, if you have a society that's emphasizing the uniform and the perfect, then people are going to be atomized, people aren't going to have relationships, communities are going to fall apart.
Because you'll always...
meaning crisis.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, I think there can also be an avoidance of relationships or jumping into them, but still using this kind of... plastering of the perfect over the other person.
Yes.
Or plastering of what... or plastering on yourself what you should be to be perfect for that other person. And I think that ultimately it's so fragile. It's so fragile because it's kind of like, well, oh no, when's the perfect going to run out? Or like, oh no, what if they see too much of me and they don't, and like I was perfect to them, but now I'm not, because like they've seen more of me and they've seen too much, or they've seen something now that they don't like, and now it's just going to suddenly make them not like me anymore, love me anymore.
I mean, if your metric is perfection, then you basically must be playing games of self-deception or hiding, because the perfection is always temporary. Well,
that's interesting because, right, it's like if we think about theology again, if God's perfect, that's why he's veiling.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
There's something about like actually to preserve the perfection. There needs to be a veiling.
But that's absolutely, and that's some of the profundity of In Praise of Shadows. There's an understanding where when you have too much light, the experience is no longer perfect.
Did you hear that line where he's like, people have forgotten the evil of excessive illumination? I was like, that's brilliant, man. The evil of excessive illumination.
Man, I mean, they got light pollution now, destroying all the birds and everything. I mean, but there's a sense there in which, if you have your goal of, you say, a relationship is when two people perfectly know one another, then there's going to be dysfunction in pathologies, right? We can go through Freud, Lacan, it doesn't matter. But if we think of this Rilke notion of preserving, defending the aloneness, but there's kind of a beauty in that, where there's a honoring of the unknowable, that is not from an honoring where you then proceed to not try to know it, but it's from a knowing that what you know, there will always be more to know.
Yeah.
It's a mystery. It's something that you know there's always more to know. Following In Praise of Shadows, that the very lighting in your phenomenological experience directed you toward thinking about the world in terms of mysteries. Whereas the very lighting of the West makes you think of the world not in terms of mystery at all. You think of the West, you think from moving from ignorance to illumination. You think about enlightenment. You're moving into enlightenment, where the architectural structure of the East will put you in a space of observance, of, observing the world around you, honoring it, making your thought know its proper bounds, just like the candlelight knows when it stops going but so far to create the certain aesthetic effect. You likewise need to know when your rationality needs to not overreach or overfit, because if it does, it will cause pathologies. But that notion of measuredness, a fittingness is not, it is not something that the phenomenological experience of artificial light, the architecture and so forth, would make you think about. In fact, the very architecture would moralize in its very presence, in its very facticity, a thinking of movement from ignorance to enlightenment, of getting rid of all darkness, and that would be better off for it, which then leads to totalitarianism. You know, the totalitarianism of artificial lighting, per se, the totalitarianism of autonomous rationality, unbound rationality, which you see in a Benjamin Fonda, a David Hume, the whole conflict of mind. So, you know, following what we're reading about in Praise of Shadows, there's something about artificial light that actually, in a way, says to you in the very being of artificial light, totalizing, total light, totalization, which has a link to totalitarianism.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good, Daniel. I'm glad you brought the word observance up again, because you're saying about like needing to be more observant of like your surroundings. If you have to find a book in the dark or with the candlelight, it's like you have to go off of your observations you made when there was sunlight or whatever. And it's like, but there's also this other idea of observance in the honoring sense.
Yeah.
You know, there's kind of I think there's more, what I would say is that there's probably something that we can learn from Tanizaki's observations and his thoughts and insights is like there's something sacred in the small light. And there's something about the observance and the actual experience of this embracing of shadows, right? That is, there's a sacredness there.
Yes.
I think there's and that's where and obviously like if we that would translate then to the veiling and how there's always something about actually the veil that makes and then this kind of gradual, you know, progression, like
right,
like in the Paradiso or something like that, where there's a kind of coming toward it.
That's right.
That is so sacred. And
as you meet the conditions to receive it, right. You have to rise yourself. There are conditions that have to be met.
Yeah, and that's just so sacred. And in the bright, sterile Western light that Tanizaki is talking about, it's like there's just straight exposure.
Just straight exposure. You know, that's right.
And that just does not leave as much room to experience the sacred.
Well, it's, you know, thanks to Mr. Zaruba and Halcon Gild and Johannes, I've been thinking about it because you've been doing that great series on Rookmaker, which gets into conditionality, Fatima with Abel Anderlecht, or the bridge over the Drina. There are all these kind of thoughts, and Dante, you mentioned it, it would be another topic, where there's certain conditions that one has to meet in order to receive certain insight or to have certain experiences that if one little variable is off, it all vanishes. You know, if the painting is not, if all the elements of the painting is not there, it doesn't point to the metaphysical dimension behind it, like in Rookmaker. Right. If Fatima is not veiled, then the desire of people to have her is not there. And yet desire naturally wants to overreach and unveil. Knowledge naturally wants to overreach and know everything. So it's this tension that exists that has to be maintained in order for the special conditionality arise that points to higher knowledge, higher wisdom, higher ways of light, and yet the variables of which make up that conditionality are often trying to devour one another. You know, light makes shadow vanish, just like that. You know, light makes shadow go away. And so it's this very interesting dynamic that has to be maintained that I think is very profound, which you don't even realize you need to even be in the business of when you live in a regime of artificial light.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because light makes shadow go away, but also makes shadows.
Yeah, that's the funny thing.
That's the funny thing.
But in order to make shadows, there's a certain condition that the room has to be in.
Yes.
There's a certain arrangement of things that have to be the case.
There's a certain presence of other things, you know, like that make those shadows.
That have to be ordered, and that gets into like St. Augustine, where things have to be ordered right, where evil is a result of a misordered good. Per se. So order comes into play. Conditionality comes into play. Yeah, and the other thing that I've been thinking about, it's an interesting question to me of, can you observe an atmosphere? Can you observe that effect that happens when you have candlelight? Do you actually see that? You know,
I think you feel it.
But that's what's so weird. Like you
feel the ambiance being different or whatever.
You feel the ambiance, but you don't observe it. And so it's hard to know or to see unless you're in it. It's kind of like, I wonder sometimes, do you see negative space? like, do you see, you kind of do, like if two people are bowing to one another, right, there's a negative space between them where you know that that represents honor. Like that nothing between them is not nothing because that space between them represents a certain kind of respect. Or obviously the FedEx symbol, right? You know, with the letters that are made up by negative space. There's a sense in which you see negative space, but it's also not something you see. The arrow, yeah, like in the FedEx sign. So likewise, I wonder, like atmosphere, the certain sort of experience that he's talking about, it's not really something you see, it's something you experience and that you know is there. And that also is going to be difficult to find a place in hard empiricism, in hard Western thinking, that doesn't really think in those terms. It's concrete. It's there, or it's not. It's on or it's off. It's there or it's not. Whereas the particular atmosphere of a candlelit room and all the different things of going to seeing the full moon on the way to the bathroom in the evening, you know, that experience, it's interesting because it's observable but it's not, and it would seem to me that in Western empiricism you can't even like have a category for that aesthetic effect.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's reminding me a bit of Merleau-Ponty's book on the phenomenology of perception, because he talks a lot about this idea of how it's there's such an interplay between the background and the foreground. And like even the outline of something, like we think of it as so concrete, but basically there's such a, it's really hard to describe it. It's basically that there's like you were saying with Cézanne, and Merleau-Ponty really appreciated Cézanne, but it's like there's these impressions. Yeah. There's almost this like experience sight. It's like this combination of those two.
It's very strange.
That actually is, if you really, really think about it, and you really like, if you really analyze, like what exactly are you experiencing / seeing when you see something. Yes. It's far more complex and nuanced than we make it out to be.
And I feel like In Praise of Shadows is trying to get at something similar.
Absolutely. And I was thinking really quick, like, I was thinking really quick about the idea of like artificial lighting. I always think like we could do a whole talk on this sometime. Maybe we will. No, I'm going to force us to. No, I'm just kidding. But like artificial, I think that's such a fascinating word because I think that it can sometimes, you know, when you and Lou talked about words and how it kind of tricks our brains and stuff. Well, it has the word art in it. Yeah. And so there's something where it's like, this is actually art. There's something like artistic about the artificial or something like that. Yeah. And yet, really, it's a replacement, and it's always kind of like well, ultimately, it's not like it's not the metaphysical.
No, I almost want to think now art visual, like it makes fissures, like splits things apart. There's no harmony, whereas art harmonizes. So artificial. Oh yeah, there you go. Artificial, different things. Well, like artificial intelligence, right? Artificial lighting.
Artificial. See, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, artivisual, like, you know, we'll just play on it all day. So, no, I think there is something about, well, the moment you're talking about seeing at night, it's artificial, it's fake. You can't really see at night. I mean, a candle, I mean, I'm
a cat, so I can, but I don't know about you. I'm just kidding. I'm not a cat.
And again, it's just, there's these questions of, are you better off because of these artificial possibilities? Do they expand our horizons in good ways or bad ways? And again, it is very interesting to me, like when you mentioned Ponty and the phenomenology of perception, it's like, do you see impressions? Like, do you observe what is the difference between seeing an impression or seeing an atmosphere and, say, empirically observing a rock or a empirical study of anything? It's a very curious difference that I feel as if the Eastern thinking that we see in Praise and Shadows is trying to point at and suggest.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think like we said, I think phenomenology is definitely, you know, I think the Eastern way of like just how Tanizaki expresses the Japanese appreciation for aesthetic, and just the Eastern thinking seems to be more phenomenological.
Well, and I think that speaks to the importance of Vinzaruba's class with Johannes, this need of practices, because you have to condition yourself to, it's almost like, to receive this holistic experience of the impression or the atmosphere, or whatever term is appropriate. Whereas if you don't condition, all you're going to do is look, and you don't really, and looking alone won't be enough to get to see the atmosphere of the candlelit room, per se, to see the meaning of the negative space in the bow, to see the meaning of these between things that are between absence and presence that seem to be pivotal for the full aesthetic experience, that without, you get a meaning crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think this has been great. Thank you, Daniel, for discussing it. If you want to check out my Anchor piece, you can find it on Anchor or Spotify. OG Rose, just type it in.
And this is a dimly lit room. We don't have candles, but the lights are not completely on, so, we've tried to be in the spirit of Eastern thought. So
absolutely.
Yeah, we've tried, so thank you.
If you could see us, we actually just have little tea light candles.
Little tea light candles.
That's it. Just like each
is
holding a little tea light
all
candle.
All the kids want to do is start a fire. They're like, Dad.
Oh gosh, yeah.
They're always making
they're
piles.
Like piles of sticks outside on the
kids know. Kids know. They know the dangers of artificial light. They're like, people are contributing to totalitarianism.
When we have a blackout or like the power goes out, they're like so happy.
They're like, yes.
Yes, we
are not bound by industrialism.
We can use candles.
All kids are Japanese, and then they grow up. So that's what ends up happening. So the power of childhood.